So, the poor state of some parts of the island has been raised by an MHK, and sad as it
Last year, I uploaded a short video entitled Welcome to the Isle of Man, which made some small criticisms of the state of the island. A number of people, not least some members of Tynwald, have suggested I take a look a year later to see if anything has changed. So, this is Welcome Back to the Isle of Man. Now, I was struck by the members of Tynwald who emailed me when last year's video appeared and said things like, "I really do share your concerns and have raised many of these in Tynwald and the Keys." And, "For the last 2 years I've been asking questions relating to these issues, and I will engage with others in Tynwald to find ways forward," etc., etc. It's not for me to say how effective members are, but a quick look at what has changed in the last year will give some indication. I'll then get on my hobby horse and highlight something utterly scandalous. Let's start on the Marine Drive. I showed the rusting old barriers along there, and they've now been replaced, and some attractive hazard tape added for good measure. I'm told it's the intention to replace all these barriers with a more permanent form of railing, at some stage. The elegant sign on the Victorian toll gate has been repainted, but the nearby barriers are still there and looking worse than ever. Apparently, it's now been decided that these barriers are not needed at all. They're going to be removed, and the rusting railings and their supports refurbished as part of an overall railing replacement programme, at some stage. Down on the promenade. This time last year, the walls of the sunken gardens had been badly damaged due to the winter storms of the previous year. It's great to see that they've now all been beautifully rebuilt. It just needs the broken lights and hanging wires to be fixed. The fountains are working again, and the Douglas Parks Department have been preparing the flower beds, and hundreds of bedding plants are being carefully placed to provide colourful displays as the season progresses. The Parks Department is responsible for all sorts of gardens and plantings around Douglas. Huge areas of grass to cut and countless flower beds and displays to tend to. But one thing they're not responsible for is this mess right next to the sunken gardens. More on that in a moment. Last year, I pointed out the tatty bits of paper stuck to the windows at the top of the superb bridge control building on South Quay. They have now been removed, but it's just such a great pity that the public aren't allowed in to see the amazing machinery inside. I also mentioned in passing the rather tatty advertising board at Port Jack. Well, that's now been completely replaced. Back on the prom, I featured the parlous state of the railings and the truly awful half-finished surface of the promenade walkway. I'm told all of this, including replacing the railings, is to be dealt with in the grand scheme for the proposed new flood wall, and apparently the first phase of this scheme has been approved and went out to tender before last Christmas. And yes, where some railings had been damaged by the sea and barriers had been cable tied into place, there are now more substantial railings. And then there was Douglas Beach. I remarked that in years gone by there were groins which helped retain the sand. They were removed a few years ago as it was thought they were no longer effective, and apparently there are no plans to replace them. There's no doubt that managing Douglas Beach is a challenge, especially when you get days like this and the storms leave you with a mess like this. Even if the gentleman from the Global Seaweed Alliance tells us that the Isle of Man is surrounded by one of the world's most untapped resources, one that is already the world's fastest growing food sector: seaweed. We're certainly not short of it. And of course, there was the completely faded sign on the sea terminal building. It was removed and has been replaced by a new one. Away from Douglas, I highlighted the disgraceful state of the world's greatest water wheel, which had been left to rot with its broken rods and shabby paintwork. But during last year, a detailed restoration took place, and they've done a superb job. The wheel is back in action, looking better than ever. But, brilliant as this phase has been, it's only part of the story. Beyond the wheel itself, there is still decay and neglect. Apparently, there is funding to fix the great T-rocker and the rod, but the whole site needs to be brought up to a proper standard. We can't leave it like this if we've any respect at all for our unique heritage. So, that's a brief roundup of what's happened in the last year, or perhaps more precisely, what hasn't yet happened. I could leave it there, but I'm afraid there are a couple of issues that I really have to get off my chest, because they're most disturbing. So this will be something of a rant, and viewers of a nervous disposition might like to proceed with caution, because I want to show you this. Woodburn Road. This is in Upper Douglas, and it's a road you've probably used many times. What you might not realise, though, is it's in a conservation area. That's an area of special architectural or historic interest, the character or appearance of which, so the government website tells us, it is desirable to enhance or preserve. Actually, the Woodburn Road Conservation Area extends for quite a distance back down into Douglas. It includes many fine terraces, all of which are intact and which represent a high point in the expansion of Douglas. Almost whichever way you look in this area and beyond, there are superb examples of early Victorian houses, which is presumably why it's a conservation area. At the upper end of Woodburn Road itself, there are some particularly fine terraces and houses. A number of them are in their own grounds and are examples of high Victorian architecture. My favourite is Rose Lodge, beautifully maintained and decorated in a delicate rose colour. So, I've got a brilliant idea. Well, actually, it's not my idea, it's the planning committee's idea. Why don't we smash them up? Yes, take a digger to them and pull them down. This is exactly what's just happened to a fine Victorian mansion in its own grounds in the conservation area by kind permission of the planning committee. Great! The site is being cleared because a developer wants to build on it. And there's me thinking the planning committee were there to protect our built heritage. I must have misunderstood the word conservation. I just have one little question for them. What do you think you're doing? Why have you allowed this to happen? Is this all our built heritage is worth? Yes, some of you might recognise this as Homefield, once owned by the government and used for the island's civil defence and more latterly for the Department of Home Affairs. The government have sold it and now allowed it to be demolished. The planning officer, in making his recommendation for demolition, said that what was going to replace Homefield was regarded as sufficiently important to the wider town, outweighing less significant concerns over the loss of a traditional building such as this. You see, the developer wants to build a care home. Now, of course, we need care homes. I shall probably need one myself before too long. There's a large one being built at the top of Victoria Road in Douglas, and another one at Bradder East in Port Erin. But here's the issue. one thing we're not short of in Douglas is brownfield sites, empty sites where buildings once stood which are crying out for development. Actually, I've counted up to 30 of them in Douglas alone. Not just the prime one at Derby Castle, but also where the old Imperial Hotel stood on Douglas Prom. And then there's this one, the so-called Town Square on Loch Prom. Frankly, this continues to be an absolute disgrace. And that huge array of iron girders in the background, well, they could be there for years to come. There's all the sites around the harbour, where the steam packet buildings used to be, the Middlemarch site, Fort Street, the Lord Street site, and on South Quay all these derelict sites in a long row, including this one next to the old Trafalgar pub where a huge apartment block was planned. But apparently they've run out of money, so this mess will be here for the foreseeable future. Empty site after empty site. Here we are along the riverside by Tesco. Then there's Bucks Road, Circular Road, Westmoreland Road, Back Strand Street, Derby Square, the back of government offices where a garden was supposed to be planted. Victoria Road, where a rare World War II air raid shelter once stood and is now a pile of smashed concrete. And this huge site where Park Road School once stood, just down from where Homefield has been demolished. Surely, demolishing our unique protected built heritage is not the way to develop Douglas for the future. Just look at what we've got, an amazing heritage of buildings which any town or even city would be proud of. Not doing this to it. One of the criteria which must be taken into account when such an application comes in is whether the cost of refurbishing the building makes it just too much to save. But in his report, the officer stated, "No details have been provided for the cost of refurbishment of the building, and it is not clear that any such efforts have been made." Well, that was a piece of research well done. I was able to get some photographs of the inside of Homefield just before it was sold by the government, and I was astonished by what was in there. It was in excellent condition and retained nearly all its Victorian features. Original fireplaces, some with elaborate tiles, beautiful ironwork on the stairs with carved newel posts, original tiled floors and ornate plasterwork in most of the rooms. It would have made a superb house in its own grounds, where traces of the original Victorian terraces were still visible in the garden. The irony is that while this was being smashed up, the members of Tynwald are preparing to receive a select committee report into the island's built heritage and what the government does to protect it. Well, members, here's a little foretaste. So, back to this appalling mess on the promenade. Last year, earlier this year. Of course, all this was mowed for TT, so bikes could be parked along here. But that's not the point. It should never have been allowed to get into this state in the first place. We don't want to look at it, and I'm sure our visitors don't want to either. Besides, this is where the horse trams should be. I'm afraid I'm going to have to say a few things about this because no one else seems to be dealing with this issue. The refurbishment of Douglas Promenade took years and ran millions over budget, but it was always promised that the horse trams would run back to the sea terminal, albeit on a single track along Loch Prom. Look at Hansard, the official record of proceedings in Tynwald. In January 2017, Tynwald approved the relaying of the tram tracks to the sea terminal. They took another vote in July of that year and again agreed that the tram tracks would be relayed to the sea terminal. In 2020, the Department of Infrastructure stated that the tram lines would be laid back to the sea terminal during the following winter, in line with the express will of Tynwald. The minister added that, I have put it on record a number of times. People need to take these promises at face value. We will come back and do the work. Gosh. Now, last December, I appeared on a Manx radio discussion programme about our heritage transport with the current Minister for Infrastructure. I was out of order enough to suggest that the money allocated for completing the horse tram track by Tynwald had been purloined for other aspects of the promenade work. Oh no, I could not use the word purloined, the Minister said. I was also out of order enough to suggest that maybe there was a senior civil servant in the Highways Department who didn't want the horse trams back. Good heavens, no, I was told. It really was most unhelpful for Mr. Guard to be saying such things, a Manx radio story quoted the Minister as saying.
Because we all care about our heritage rail, and the question is about how we secure it, and actually suggesting that DOI is trying to get rid of it in some way is unhelpful.
Well, great. I am delighted to have been put in my place and for these things to have been clarified. So, at least 3 votes in Tynwald for the complete horse tram track. A minister telling us we have to believe what they say, and confirmed the money hasn't been purloined and everyone in the department is working hard to get the trams back. So again, just one tiny question. Where the hell are they? Just look at this. I filmed this 7 years ago before the promenade works started. It was an astonishing event that you couldn't see anywhere else on the planet. This is a unique piece of world heritage that this little island has. The only surviving system like this in the world, nearly 150 years old. But you will never see this again. It's gone. The horse trams have been reduced to this. Thank you, Tynwald. And no one can say when or if they will ever run the full length of the promenade again. I can't understand why no one in Tynwald is raising this issue. I thought if you voted for something in Tynwald, then it happened. Isn't that the case? Or is it, as the Chief Minister has recently said, there are some government officers who have become too powerful? I don't know who he was referring to. But certainly what Tynwald has voted for hasn't happened. You see, it's not up to an officer, a minister, or even the Council of Ministers to decide to dismantle our heritage. It's not yours to do that with. It belongs to the Manx people, and we thought we'd elected you to look after it. So, I challenge any member of Tynwald to stand up and say, we are having the horse trams back. I challenge any member of Tynwald to stand up and say, this is simply not acceptable. Will any member say, this is not acceptable? If we're trying to attract visitors, why is this allowed to happen? And just look at this. Some old container, ironically called Manx Waste Solutions. Is that the solution, just to leave it in a field? This has been here for years outside of Andreas, and no one's bothered to move it or to ask for it to be moved. But if you want to see something even worse, look what comes into view as you go round the headland at Housedrake on our glorious trams. This has been here for years as well. A pile of junk, an old skip, old cans of paint and buckets of this, that and the other. Do people just leave this and no one gives a damn? Actually, since I filmed this a couple of weeks ago, someone has come and cleared most of this away. It didn't take long, and it looks so much better. It's not difficult. Too difficult, apparently, for this appalling mess, right on the promenade. What is this supposed to be? This is the capital of the island. Oh, and that cat's cradle of girders in the background? Well, as it happens, a member of Tynwald put down a question recently about this exciting development coming soon to find out exactly what was happening. And effectively, the minister said, it's nothing to do with us. Well, actually, it is to do with you. You're the government. What are you saying? Someone can come along, demolish buildings, start a development, and then, as on South Quay as well, just abandon it? Just walk away, leaving a huge mess without so much as an explanation, an apology, any statement? By the way, someone's broken down the door to this site so that anyone can get into it, and it's a dangerous site. But it's nothing to do with the government. It seems there's no regulation, no legislation, no way of holding anyone to account as Douglas gets demolished. Could I respectfully suggest that instead of asking questions, someone actually does something to sort this out? Just look at the island at the moment. The trees are all in leaf with their delicate green colours. The gorse has been blooming. The may is out, as are the rhododendrons and azaleas. And there are drifts of bluebells. The birds are back at the Sugarloaf, and the island looks gorgeous. It's just unfortunate that you've got to drive past this to get to any of it. Isn't there anyone who can take this in hand? I know members of Tynwald have extraordinary pressures on them and really serious issues to deal with, but it's just so disappointing that this issue is right down at the bottom of the list and has been for years. Well, that's my rant over. You can come out from under the table now. And despite making these videos, I've realised that nothing I say makes the slightest difference. And I can prove that. Some years ago, I actually petitioned Tynwald on Tynwald Day. I delivered a petition of grievance, and my grievance was that the government wasn't doing enough to protect our built heritage. The petition was actually debated in Tynwald, but the night before the debate, the minister wrote to all the members asking them not to support the motion. And so they didn't. They threw it out. I've given presentations to members. I've given evidence to a select committee. I've made radio programmes and videos, and it doesn't make any difference. So I can't do anything. Is there anyone who can?